Yes, we'll wait till the magic hour.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Yeah, people still
Oh,
coming.
there's Dave. David, are you still in Australia?
No,
Yes, we're still here.
Look,
Yes.
We've been watching Toby's lectures on Poland, and we missed his one last week because Zoom just wouldn't work.
All right.
what,
But
what
never
time?
mind.
What time of day is it in Australia?
6:30, and it's 24 degrees C. And we think
Oh,
it's
right.
cool here.
No, we wouldn't like that. We wouldn't like it.
No.
April.
I fell asleep
But I'll, yeah,
through
leave it with me. I'll call in the next.
last week.
Okay, get us to come in.
All right, I've got to mute ourselves now.
Right.
Why not?
Well, I remember we disconnected those and we had trouble with them.
Yeah, no, that means that we should have, you see Judy in all her glory, Jonathan,
Yeah, absolutely spot on. No problem.
right? In which case, Judy, another minute and we'll make a start. I'm watching the clock in the bottom right hand corner,
oh. What clock?
10:29.
Oh, that sort of clock. I'm looking for a clock.
Oh,
Shows how technological I am.
I was going to say, stop looking for a grandfather clock. It's just not there. It's not big enough.
The clock face. No.
right. Good morning, everyone. I've had a complaint from Judy this morning. The snowdrops are too large,
I didn't say that.
so I shall be trying for some bluebells for next week. Judy, over to you, my dear. You're on.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for your loyalty. Hope you're well. The reign of William I, I think we're on to sort of familiar ground now. For those of us who had a sort of traditional education, history more or less started with the Normans. So it would probably seem quite familiar to you. First of all, I'll put the heading, the land. And just to emphasize that there are different ways of countries being taken over by another country. I mean, it is happening all the time in this world and has been for thousands of years, that one country takes over, defeats another country and takes over. It might be in an economic way, or it might be through warfare. But just to emphasize that the Norman takeover in this country was total. There were no compromises. There were no discussions with the Anglo-Saxon hierarchy. It was defeat. They'd killed the king, they'd killed Harold. The land was completely taken over. It wasn't just occupied, it was completely confiscated from the Anglo-Saxon landowners and landholders and redistributed to Normans. It'd be very interesting to know how our ancestors coped with this, but obviously they were illiterate. There's no information about how it felt to be taken over in this savage and dramatic way. Anybody that stepped out of line, anyone that complained, would be savagely punished. As we said last week, although William I was a Christian, a devout Christian, he used extremely savage methods when it came to rebellion or protest of any kind. There was absolutely no way. There were no discussions. There were no meetings. The Anglo-Saxons had been completely defeated on the field of battle. that isn't usually, in most cases, that doesn't sort anything out. But in this instance, it did. There were rebellions for several years, but the result was that William and his Normans were completely in control. 4,000 Anglo-Saxon landowners replaced by 200 Norman landowners. And the new landowners, this is probably familiar to you, the establishment of what was known as the feudal system. If you ever read 1066 and all that, they called it the feudal system. The feudal system. Probably thinking, yes, that sounds familiar. So remember that. I can remember doing that. The whole point about the feudal system is the land belonged to the king, and the king then gave land. No, he didn't give it in the usual sense. He distributed the land, but there were many duties and obligations placed on the new landowners. They held the land, they didn't own it. The king owned the land. That was made very clear from the outset. Everyone, the shorthand way of describing the feudal system, every man had a lord, including the king. He acknowledged God as his lord. So all the land belonged to the king. He then distributed to his knights, who became barons. They became the new aristocrats. Many aristocrats today are descended from these aforesaid Normans, and who fought at the Battle of Hastings. This was the king keeping his promise, or the duke keeping his promise, that if they helped him to become King of England, he would reward them suitably with land and a title. And he kept his promise. And therefore a very rigid social hierarchy developed. The knights then distributed land and down to peasants, who had many obligations and hardly any rights. They weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. They're in some sort of mysterious middle ground. Not actually slaves. They couldn't be bought and sold as slaves can, but they held their land from what became known as the Lord of the Manor, who was a knight. Many obligations, including fighting, and the whole system was really based on an obligation to fight for their overlord whenever that was required. So the king could expect his barons to fight, and they expected their knights to fight, and the knights then expected the peasants to fight. That's how they created an army.
Ah, got it.
So the whole idea was that everybody owed obligations to their overlord. The overlord had some obligations to the class below. And basically it worked for hundreds of years as a system. It was a very well thought out system. Our ancestors were probably the bottom rung of the ladder.
Again,
We would be, our ancestors would probably be the serfs or villeins, the bondmen, they were called. They were bound, they were in bond, which meant not slaves, but not much better than slaves. Basically couldn't leave the village without a kind of passport, a kind of license from the Lord of the Manor. They're allowed to go to the nearest marketplace if they had any surplus crops or goods to sell, but they must be back within the day. They must be back before dark, a bit like Cinderella. They had to be back in daylight. If they stayed longer, then they were treated as runaways, and they would be beaten when they got back. They would be punished for staying out too late. So they were treated like children. But mostly they stayed within their village. Our ancestors had a very narrow life. They lived in the village. They lived, they died in the village in which they were born. Very controlled life. The king was very afraid of rebellions and treachery because of what had happened in his early life. His backstory was full of rebellions and treason in Normandy. So he was, today we'd say, paranoid about uprisings, dissension, and basically people not doing as they were told. Very cleverly, he dealt with this in a very clever and cunning way. When he distributed the land among his followers, his knights, that became barons, he scattered their estates all over this country. They could have 11 different areas, estates, in large estates, but scattered all over the country. Very clever, very inconvenient. That was part of a policy. That was all quite deliberate. First of all, the barons wouldn't be able to create a power base. If they'd had all their land in one area, they could challenge the king. But they didn't have all their land in one area. It was scattered all over the place. Secondly, they were required to build castles on their estates. So that meant the king got a lot of free castles that helped him to control the country. Well, we've got so many in this country. They built, the barons built a castle on their estate, and that meant the king got all this free security, you could say. Then the barons spent a lot of their time traveling around, visiting their different estates. That meant, well, they were out of, they couldn't cause any mischief. They were sort of occupied in traveling. So that prevented them from rebelling against the king. They couldn't organize anything because they really were moving around the country most of the time. As they traveled, they were able to police the country. They would spot any suspicion and anything they saw as they traveled, that the Saxons were plotting revenge or plotting some sort of uprising, a sort of sedition. They would be able to see that as they traveled throughout the realm. So the king had a kind of spy network thrown in for nothing. So this was very clever, that did keep the risk of rebellion to a minimum. It doesn't mean there weren't any rebellions, when there obviously were. In the first few years following the conquest, yes, there were rebellions and uprisings, but the king dealt with them so savagely that after a time, the Saxons just gave up and accepted what had happened and acknowledged that they were the underdogs, and that was the way it was going to be. Changes, just something that I didn't mention that I should have mentioned, another cunning thing that the king had done, the Duke had done before he became king. When Duke William was planning his invasion and takeover of this country, he did a very clever thing. He wrote to the Pope. As a good worshipping Christian, he wrote to the Pope and said, okay, a lot of detail in the letter about how evil Harold of England was, new King of England, that he was an oath breaker, and went into detail about how how Harold had allegedly taken a vow on holy relics to make William the next King of England, that it was his right and due, and that Harold had stolen the crown from him, that he, William, was the rightful heir, that when King Edward died, he had left the crown to William, that Harold had taken an oath of allegiance to William, and now he had broken his word. He was an oath breaker. That was the most dreadful thing at that time. He defended God, and therefore the invasion of England was not just an ambitious duke wanting something that didn't belong to him. He was doing God's work. He was punishing the unrighteous. He was punishing an oath breaker. So it was kind of like a crusade right versus wrong. That was very clever of him, because people in those days, obviously, we shouldn't say superstitious, because that's really quite offensive to say that they were superstitious. They were God-fearing. That's what they were. They were God-fearing. And by explaining all this to the Pope, William got something very important, which was the Pope's unconditional support. Not only that, but the Pope sent something specific, something visible to help William in his campaign, because he said it was a righteous campaign, that he was a wronged man, and that Harold of England was an oath breaker, and therefore did not deserve to be king, in fact deserved to be dead. So what he sent is called a pallium, which was it was a banner made of white silk with the Pope's emblem, coat of arms, embroidered on it, and it had been blessed. It had been laid on the high altar of St. Peter's. It had been blessed by the Pope and the congregation, and the Pope sent a lovely letter saying, you know, good luck in all your enterprises, may God be with you, and here is something to fly at the front of in front of your troops, to lead them into battle. This banner, I mean, it couldn't have been better. What wonderful PR. And it is believed that some of the men who were hesitating, wondering whether to support William on what seemed like a difficult enterprise, you know, how are they going to get across the channel with all their horses and everything? There are all sorts of logistical problems, were persuaded by the fact that he had the support of the Pope, because they then felt that there would be a blessing upon them. Probably they'd do less time in purgatory, because they had supported something which the Pope had sort of ratified and blessed. So again, William was a very clever operator. That certainly worked very much in his favour.
Interesting, Judy, to speculate that there's another thought that there might be a paper buried in the Vatican Library that we'd love to get our hands on to be able to read.
Yes.
Through the years.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, evidence is so important, and obviously evidence from such a long time ago is doubly precious.
Yeah.
Changes in the landscape. Well, the main one was our ancestors did have some stone buildings in Saxon England, but nothing on the scale of the Norman buildings. The Normans built in what was called a massive way. They built huge buildings and massive stones, and they built tall buildings, large, and the word massive is used a lot. Amazing buildings that the Saxons had never imagined being possible. As you probably remember, the Normans couldn't build pointy arches. They were round like the Romans. The Romans built rounded arches. But apart from that, the Normans were fantastic architects. There wasn't such a thing as an architect. They were masons. They were master masons, which was the equivalent of an architect, that they designed the cathedrals and the castles and the churches and the monasteries and the nunneries. They were all built of stone. The first ones we actually see on the Bayeux Tapestry weren't built of stone. They were built very, very quickly. There's actually a picture of one of a Norman castle being built while Harold was still up north, fighting up in Yorkshire. William had arrived, if you remember, and was sort of settled in very nicely, exercising the horses, and pictures of people having feasts and checking out their own suitable place to have the key battle, and also building a castle. So we can see how they built the first castle. So Motte and Bailey, you might remember that from school, a Motte and Bailey castle. Mott being the French for a mountain or a hill. So you built an artificial hill, if there wasn't one available. There wasn't a natural hill around in the area where you needed it. Then you made a hill artificially. And it's the same principle that you use on a beach when you're building a sand castle. Sort of make a circle with your spade, start digging the sand up, throwing it into the middle, making a sort of ditch, which is going to be a moat, or maybe a moat, maybe you're going to fill it with water, a dry moat or a wet moat, depends. Throwing all the sand into the middle, patting it down with your spade, making a mound, and then you start with your bucket and your wet sand, putting something on top of the mound that you've made. So that was the principle of building the original Motte and Bailey castles, using the Saxons as slave labour. I've said they didn't actually have slaves as such, but they, of course, used the local people as slave labour. So just getting a huge gang of Saxons to start digging. If there wasn't a suitable crag or hill, then you created an artificial hill. Not just with soil, but with lots of stones and pebbles and things to sort of hold it in place, to make it more solid. They've done quite a bit of excavation of ancient motts and found that they were actually technically very cleverly designed, that there were circles every so often of stone or stones, pebbles or kind of gravel to hold the whole thing in place, because just soil wouldn't be very strong. The original edifice on the top was made of wood, because it was a temporary sort of arrangement, and a palisade also made of wood. But even that, it wasn't just a fence. It was a double fence with space in the middle, and you filled that with stones and soil. So it was really very, very solid. And a drawbridge across across the ditch or moat. So those are the very early Motte and Bailey castles. But later, when they couldn't find a suitable hill, the Normans simply built a high building, which again was not known to the Saxons, a big, what was called a keep, a tall building, sometimes 3 stories high, to create it. So that the top story, you could see for 20 miles on a clear day, you could see your enemies in the distance. That was the whole idea, the defensive idea. They weren't building them tall just for the sake of building, showing off what they could do. Obviously, it had there's a practical reason, so that they could see their enemies and prepare for an attack. So Kenilworth, for example, there are many of these examples of huge Norman keeps, tiny windows, tall, a massive building. Again, the workforce were the humiliated and defeated Saxons. So you can imagine how thrilled our ancestors would be about having to do that, working for the enemy, wishing that they would all drop dead, but having to work. So castles, cathedrals, and Martin's found a lovely diagram showing cathedrals that were Norman in construction, originally Norman. Now, admittedly, over the centuries, better styles of building were created, Gothic, much more ornamented. The Normans had, there were not so much ornamentation, but very, very solid. On the other hand, when you actually go around cathedrals, it's surprising how many of when the Normans built a cathedral, sometimes chunks of it fell down. Sort of, although they built well, they were almost making it up as they went along. It wasn't totally perfect. There were mistakes, either uneven or unstable ground, or lightning strikes, or just they hadn't built it very well, and it fell down. So a lot of these cathedrals, there isn't all that much left of the Norman construction. You've got a perfect example of a Norman cathedral in Durham, which has hardly changed since it was built. And the Tower of London, of course, the White Tower is Norman. A lot of the castles, the keeps have remained. The cathedrals not so much, because cathedrals tended to be a work in progress. People perfected them, they improved them, a bit like people doing home improvements, adding sections on, or just changing the windows in particular. Norman windows were small. Norman buildings were huge, but they were dark. They hadn't learned how to make large windows without damaging the structure and making it unstable. By the 14th century, the architects the masons could create very big windows with tracery looking. So many cathedrals, there's not much left of the original Norman construction. But an excellent example, of course, is Durham, where the original pillars, Gloucester, the original pillars, massive pillars. So what the Norman created was this word massive again, powerful, and it created fear. Apparently, our ancestors, the Saxons, were fearful, which was also a good idea. Putting psychological fear into them. You know, how can anybody build these huge structures? They were dominant. They were what we call today a visual aid to show how dominant the Normans were, to impress, and it certainly worked. Our ancestors were very impressed and afraid. So changes in the landscape we've explained, castles and large stone buildings, greater use of arable land, forests being cut down or trees being cut down to create more farmland. Forest laws, we've mentioned those already, absolutely hated. The Saxons, of course, had originated from forest areas in Germany. They loved trees. Before they became Christian, they had worshipped trees. The forest laws it was a Norman idea to create no-go areas for the Saxons, to create special places for hunting, so that the Saxons wouldn't be sort of trapping the game and spoiling the pleasure of the barons and the knights who wanted to go hunting. Cannock Chase and Sutton Park came under these forest laws. Peasants couldn't enter these areas without a license. So imagine how infuriating that was. This was their country, and they had to have a license to go into what had always been open common land belonging to everybody. And now they couldn't go in. Well, I mean, obviously, most of the time they couldn't get a license. They weren't allowed to take dogs in there in case the dogs started chasing the animals, which was sacrosanct. And you know, that our ancestors started to mutter that the animals were more important than they were, which was true. Now, the new forest laws, the animals were more prestigious than the people. The punishments for disobeying the forest laws, again, were savage. Usually mutilation of some kind. I mean, the Normans were great on mutilation, chopping bits off people. Again, you know, they were supposed to be so pious. Where was their piety? In actual fact, they did some really dreadful things, dreadful laws passed to create this subservient society of obedient people who wouldn't cause any trouble. So the forest laws were thoroughly and absolutely detested. They were seen as part of the Norman domination and the cruelty of the Normans. A lot of royal charters were created and granted. The Normans believed in trade. That doesn't mean the Saxons hadn't believed in trade. Of course they had. But the Normans did something to actually stimulate trade, creating small market towns. So there was more what we call it, the development of urban centres. Often, well, usually near a castle or a cathedral, and that's still true today, that many of our small market towns, the marketplace is either very close to a cathedral or where there was a castle or both. And that certainly stimulated development and certainly made it easier for trade to take place, and the Saxons did eventually benefit from that. But when this first happened, I don't think our Saxon ancestors were feeling that the Normans had created any benefits whatsoever. They just hated them, hated and loathed them for obvious reasons. Administrative changes. There were fewer rich and powerful people. The power was in the hands of fewer top people. The king had greater power than the Saxon monarchs had. The manorial system developed, which again, you're probably thinking, you'll remember this from school. The north of England, I know we've said this before, and I'm not saying it just because I'm from the north of England, but very important to remember how awful the punishment had been for the north of England when they rebelled. That over and over again in the Domesday survey, villages in the north are recorded virtually as having disappeared. The word waste is written, this awful word, waste, means the land is no longer profitable. There's nobody there to develop, to farm the land. Waste, wasteland. Where are the people? You might well ask, where were the people? They had been driven out to starve. And that's why there weren't any more rebellions after the harrying of the north. The Saxons had to accept the bitter truth that they couldn't compete with the Normans. They couldn't fight back. The Normans had all the power and used it in a savage way. And so this awful word, waste, what had happened to the inhabitants? Well, we know from the chroniclers of the time that many of them literally starved. So wasteland for many years. Sometimes a village did revive, but very often there's just the name of the village recorded, and that village sort of disappeared. On the positive side, trade with continental Europe increased because the Duke of Normandy was still the Duke of Normandy. He was King of England, but he was still Duke of Normandy. And he and his entourage did a lot of travelling back and forth across the Channel, being a bit like the Hanoverians, going back to Hanover all the time. So trade with continental Europe increased, and that meant eventually that trickled down to even the villeins and the serfs. Links with Normandy, very important, as I just said, a lot of travel going on. The Norman nobles generally had land both in Normandy and in England. Language is fascinating. For many years, there were two separate languages. There was no suggestion of people learning both, becoming bilingual. The Saxons continued to speak their Germanic language, and the Normans spoke a form of French called Norman French. We've got the Latin words mixed up in it, and very different languages. If you're at school like I was, I did French and German. Very different, totally different. You know, there are no words that you say, oh, well, you know, that's borrowed from, I know what that word means because I've done that in German and therefore I know what it means in French. It doesn't work at all. It works with Spanish and Italian and French. There are Manse languages, which are sort of originally from Latin. German, different. So it's interesting that these two languages that sort of clashed in this country. How did it ever turn into English? Which is a fascinating story. How did our language eventually develop? Was it a mixture of them both? To some extent, yes, it was. So language gradually developed and turned into what we know today as English. And certainly the grammar changed, so it's no longer Germanic with the verb at the end of the sentence. Reconstruction of the church, you could say that this was a positive, you could say this was a plus point, except that all the top positions were held by Normans. All this Anglo-Saxon bishops sort of got the sack, and Normans were put in place. By 1087, the year that the Conqueror died, and the year that the Domesday Survey was sort of published, there were only 2 Anglo-Saxon bishops left. And a lot of reorganisation had taken place. The Normans were very good at organising, at managing. And so they moved from rural areas to the new towns. So Dorchester to Lincoln, Lichfield to Chester, Sherborne to Salisbury. So the original Saxon bishoprics were sort of demoted, and new bishoprics or dioceses were created. This gave the king greater administrative and military control of the church across England, and made the church authorities more powerful because they lived in towns, not in the country. The original idea for cathedrals was that they were a bit like monasteries. They should be built in remote areas, following the early tradition of Christian monks who went to live in the desert, kind of following the idea of John the Baptist living off the land, living in a very simple way as part of their Christian devotion. They must give themselves a hard time. They must suffer for their faith, and they mustn't have any luxuries or anything, and they must live like the original hermits in the desert that then grouped together and formed the early monasteries. And the idea then was that you should live in a remote area, and that was part of your devotion to God. Well, the Normans sort of believed in that, but they thought it was a much better idea to not suffer quite so much and live in a town. It was sort of better all for everybody concerned. But mainly because so they could keep an eye on the church. It was sort of all this sort of paranoia that William had, that he didn't want people sort of living a long way away where he didn't know what they were up to. He didn't trust anybody. So this was a sort of reorganization. We've still got that system today, that the great cathedrals, the great monasteries became much, not all of them, because then the Cistercians set up monasteries in remote areas like Fountains Abbey, and some of the great ones in Yorkshire, they were miles from anywhere. But initially, when the Normans took over, that's what they encouraged. And then we come to the Domesday Book. It wasn't called the Domesday Book. That wasn't it. That was a nickname. It had a much posher name than that. Liber de Wintonia, or the Great Survey, or the King's Book, because it was directly the King's idea. It was King William's idea, again, or part of his paranoid attitude. He believed he wasn't being paid enough taxes. He was right. Our ancestors were not happy shelling out money to the conquerors, and they were lying about how much they'd paid before. Of course they were. It was about the only little bit of agency they had left to cheat on their taxes. And of course the king realised this, and the king needed money for his army, keep his army on, supply his army. So the king, being a very suspicious character anyway, became even more suspicious, and with right, that he wasn't getting his due amount of money. There wasn't even people were cheating. So the answer to that was to do a huge survey and ask a lot of questions, and a lot of searching questions about the actual situation in each settlement, each village. What are the assets in this village? We don't trust you, we're coming to check up. We're going to see with our own eyes whether you are telling the truth about how poverty-stricken you are and how you can't pay your taxes because there's been a terrible blight on the animals and all the trees have died and you haven't got any resources at all. And please, we can't pay our taxes this year because we've had such a terrible time. You know, the farming's been absolutely awful and the weather's been against us. Lies. The king wanted to know exactly what was going on. So this is a wonderful example of a system, again, the Norman system, which was very efficient. Nobody's ever doubted that. And the detail was so that when the investigation started, because that's what it was really, an investigation, a government investigation. The questions were so detailed that the Saxons, our ancestors, said this was like the last day of the world. It was like the end of the world. It was the great day of judgment where God will ask all these searching questions and then decide whether people should go to heaven or hell. So it was a sarcastic reference to the detail that these investigators were going to go into that gave the name Doomsday, and spelt in the old-fashioned way, because we spell doom with two O's, D-O-O-M. The day of doom, which is the last day of this world, when the world comes to an end, the great day of judgment predicted in the Bible, in the book of Revelation. So, and that name stuck, the Doomsday Book. That certainly wasn't its official name. It was a sarcastic reference to the detail of this investigation. And it seemed like the end of the world anyway, that the Normans were coming around. And no, who knew what was going to happen? I mean, our ancestors would have thought, oh, they're going to kill us. You know, they think we've done something wrong. Why are they asking? Why have they come to our village? Why are they asking all these questions? They would have been, by this time, they would be feeling somewhat paranoid because the Normans were somewhat unpredictable when it came to punishments. You stepped out of line, you were punished savagely. So it's Britain's earliest public record, and we're very proud of it because no other country has got anything similar. Well, they've got local tax investigations and descriptions of land, but nothing on a national scale. And it's for scholars in other countries. They access the Doomsday Survey, hoping that it will shed light on their feudal system, on this particular period of history, which is somewhat lacking in evidence and in primary source material. And other countries really very envious of the fact that we've got this absolute insight into life in 1086, 1087. A unique window, it's been described, a unique window on medieval society. And it's been described as England's finest treasure. You might think that's a bit over the top, but that's how it's been described. So 1086, the king made this decision because he was feeling that he was being cheated, and he wasn't going to have that. He wanted to find the truth, find out what he was really owed by these wretched people that he'd conquered. He needed to raise taxes to pay for his army, as we've said, and he needed to have the information regarding the value of the land. So to compare it with how much it had been, what its value was in the reign of King Edward, compared with how much it's worth now. And if its value had gone up, then the taxes should go up accordingly. That was the argument. If it's worth more, you pay more. So it wasn't just that they've been lying, it was also that hopefully the land had increased in value over the 20 years. So this massive investigation was set up, and it's still remarkable that they could do this, they could organize this and follow it through so efficiently, with all the limitations of using a dipping pen, you know, carrying the ink with them and using a quill pen to make their notes. You know, we think of all the things we've got now, it would be a pretty massive undertaking today. But here are men traveling on horseback, using primitive methods, but managing to survey not the whole country. There were gaps, mysterious gaps in some cases, that places that weren't surveyed. But what an amazing achievement! And again, hats off. Whatever we think about the Normans, you know, hats off to them for this, because it was undertaken in a short time and in a very efficient manner. So first of all, the country was divided into 7 areas or circuits. And we're very fond of this word circuit because it meant, and we still use it for judges, a circuit, meaning that you end up where you started. 3 or 4 commissioners assigned to each, and they did what we do today to save time. They had pre-prepared questions written out ready on their manuscript, on their parchment, and the equivalent of a clipboard. So that's what we do when we do surveys to save time. You've got the questions ready, and then you just fill in the answers. So that was good, clever. And they asked a series of questions, and they checked as well. So they didn't just ask the peasants, how much woodland have you got? They measured it just to make sure that the peasants weren't lying. And there were 2 volumes, there were 2 separate surveys. One was called Great Doomsday. They left out East Anglia, Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk, and then another survey, and that was called the Little Doomsday, published separately. And then the 2 were put together. And for some reason, which had never really totally been explained, they left out, annoyingly, London, Durham, Winchester and Northumberland, which is rather infuriating that they didn't do London. And nobody seems to quite know why. Anyway, 888 parchment pages and 2 million words. I mean, when you say that, it is an incredible achievement with the primitive nature of recording in those days. Riding on horseback. How did they write all these notes? Well, they did. They managed. Another irony is that King William never saw it. He died before it was ready. It had been written, it was written what we call in rough. Well, perhaps we don't say that anymore, but we used to when we were at school. In rough notes, but it had to be written up by official scribes who would make it look beautiful, and they did, using 2 different kinds of ink. They used red for important things and black ink for the not so important. It lives now in the National Archives in Kew, London, but it is all online. And it's accessed all the time by students doing, working. It's still revealing secrets. There are still different things being looked at by students, not just in this country, but in other parts of Europe, where they also had a feudal system and trying to work out for themselves what it was like in their country, because they haven't got any actual information, so they're borrowing the Doomsday Book. And I did ask Martin if he could find. I've put the three in, the local three, well, just randomly: the Sutton entry, the Aston entry, and the Birmingham entry. Erdington's quite interesting. Erdington was a separate settlement. It's also interesting if you look at what's now the Birmingham conurbation. All the separate villages were all recorded separately because Birmingham was hardly there. Birmingham was very, very small and poor. It was the poorest of all the villages in the area. Birmingham only had 9 households, and it was worth £1 in 1066, and it was worth £1 in 1086. It hadn't improved. It hadn't developed at all. It's really quite bizarre to think that Birmingham was really inferior. Hardly there. It was there like a hamlet. And sort of look at Birmingham now. But Birmingham is very much an amalgamation of many, many villages. Rather than Birmingham growing, it was Birmingham sort of drawing in other places which were actually much more prosperous at this time. The best place in this area was Aston, because interestingly, Aston had a mill and a church, because they mentioned a priest. Some people have said, well, that doesn't mean there was a church, but there was something like maybe a chapel of rest or chapel of ease. Aston was by far and away boss village. It's so much interesting. I think it's more important than, a lot more important than Birmingham. William, son of Ansculf, holds it. Earl Edwin held it. So that was the first thing that they recorded. Who is the present owner? They didn't own the land, they held the land. Who's the current landholder? William, son of Ansculf. Earl Edwin held it. You know, the poor Saxon guy who's got kicked off his land. And then how many households, and then the actual status of the peasants. One slave is mentioned. Now the Normans claimed that they got rid of slavery. How could you become a slave? Well, you could become a slave because you could be a prisoner of war. You could have been brought in from another country, because that's what happened to prisoners of war. They were used as slaves. Or it was a family that had got themselves into such terrible debt, or they'd done something wrong but not bad enough to be killed. They would take one of the children as slaves, make them into a slave, or it could be an adult. And they were described as slaves, but they still couldn't be bought and sold. It wasn't quite the kind of slavery that we're accustomed to, like African slavery. It was, but being used as slave labor, which we're familiar with because of the Nazis using slave labor in the Second World War. But a bit embarrassing, you know, a Christian country, and it says one slave. The Aston entry, one slave, and in other areas more slaves than that. The Sutton entry, now Sutton did have plough land, but Sutton's wealth lay in its woodland, because the soil around here isn't all that brilliant. I mean, if you're an ardent gardener, you'll know that, and it's very pebbly. So Sutton was not known for its wonderful farmland and its riches being the result of rich soil. The value lay in the woodland, because so many things were, of course, in those days are made of wood. Timber was a very important resource. And so Sutton hasn't changed in value. It was £4, and at the time of the survey, it's £4. whereas poor old Birmingham was only worth £1. It's really interesting that Birmingham is so inferior, and is actually Birmingham is one of the smallest. It's in the 40% of little unimportant settlements, whereas Aston important and Sutton not exactly important, but certainly great value in its woodland. Trees grow well, arable crops not so well. So the Domesday Book is very, very significant and important, and Martin's found a lovely picture of it. It was bound and made into a book, the King's Book, and then Martin's found some lovely entries to show how meticulously they wrote it out in a kind of shorthand, which is also a bit groundbreaking. You know, we think of shorthand as being a very modern development, a very modern invention. But here were these Norman scribes thinking, oh, I don't need to write the whole word out. I can use an abbreviation or just initials rather than writing it out in full. And after a while, after you've read it through, you become familiar with the abbreviations and begin to realize that there's a sort of pattern to it. Very, very detailed. The Saxons, who of course were the victims of all this investigation, they knew what was going to happen, that taxes were going to go up. They were very contemptuous about this and sort of said, you know, what kind of people are they? They're counting every pig, they're counting every sheep. You know, this is, you know, what sad people these Normans are, you know, sort of so almost like trivial, but they did know really that it was going to end up with them paying more, which of course is the whole point of the Domesday survey, was for the king to find out exactly what he was owed from each community in terms of how valuable the land was, how many animals they got. The animals being important, that if they'd say if the value of the village was such and such in 1066, and then suddenly they'd got a whole lot more animals, they were obviously prospering, and therefore they should be paying more taxes. That was the whole idea. So a very, very important resource, and still is an important resource. It is still being investigated, and various computer programs being run through various computer programs, all sorts of comparisons being made. And one very interesting thing that happened, I can't remember exactly how long ago it was after I'd left university, but while I was teaching, certainly while I was teaching, that a student had decided he was going to well, he was working on the Domesday survey, and then noticed a pattern developing, a sort of swathe of land, wide at the bottom and tapering. So he noticed this shape where the villages had lost value, and he thought that was strange, because it was from the south up to the north through the Midlands. This sort of like an arrow without an arrowhead on it, but sort of wide and then narrowing. And he discovered this pattern, that over this area, the value had gone down rather considerably, significant devaluation. And then he tracked it, and then he made a map, which was kind of very early days of computers being able to do that. He created a map, and lo and behold, it was the journey that the army had taken up to Yorkshire for the harrying of the north, and the army had lived off the land. They had taken goods, animals, corn, etc., from these villages as they travelled. They lived off the land. In other words, they hadn't supplied themselves with all the food and so on that they needed. They had taken from the villages as they travelled. And then it narrowed as they got to the north because they've still got stuff that they'd taken from the Midlands. And it was a very definite shape. And that was one of the first things, or the first recorded occasions when a computer had revealed something historically accurate, that was the route taken by the Norman force that went up to Yorkshire, and it was called the harrying of the North, the punishment of the North for having rebelled against the king. So obviously the North, we knew what had happened there because it was written in the Norman in the Domesday Survey, waste. So that was well known. You didn't need a computer to work that out. But this was a computer generated map showing very clearly the route of the Norman soldiers, the Norman army, taking from the land, taking from the people, and possibly people being left to starve. If they took everything, then the people wouldn't have had anything to eat in the winter. So that kind of thing is still happening, the sort of research being done on a fascinating scale, and every so often there'll be a learned historical paper is published saying, look what we've discovered about the Domesday, or what we've discovered about this particular part of the country, if it was prospering or it was doing very, very badly, and then we want to find out why it was doing badly, and so on. So one of our really fantastic resources, we've got the Domesday Survey, we've got the Bayeux Tapestry, and other countries are really jealous, which is good. They're really, really envious of these two fantastic resources from this otherwise difficult to study part of our history. So thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you,
Take
Judy.
care.
Right, we should be gathering again in a fortnight on the 20th, and we're going on to building of castles and cathedrals and
Oh, well, we're going to do first. Well, we're going to do chronologically. We're going to do Rufus, the baddie, Henry VIII. William's son, our next king, William Rufus, the one that was killed in the New Forest. So he's interesting, but we will do castles as well. We'll throw castles in as well.
okay.
Yeah, castles and William Rufus.
Thank you very much, Judy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Judy.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Judy.